So hello, I'm Liz Oakley-Brown, an educator in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. And I'm thrilled to lightly host a discussion this afternoon, a conversation, we hope, between two brilliant contemporary poets of our time about their interest in Renaissance poetry. And that's poetry produced somewhere between 1480 to 1700. So Professor Paul Farley is a professor of poetry at Lancaster University, and Professor Paul Muldoon is currently Lancaster University's distinguished visiting professor of poetry, and we're delighted to welcome him from Princeton University this afternoon, where he's currently Howard G.B. Clark Professor. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, thank you. But the Lancaster connection is the big one today. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, and rightly so. Thank you. And the topic of contemporary poetry, of contemporary poets' engagement in Renaissance with Renaissance verse is one that's really close to my professional heart. And when I first started teaching in a university about 20 years ago, I was asked to teach from this marvellous anthology. I don't know if you can see that, which is Karen McCarthy's Bittersweet Contemporary Black Women's Poetry. And there's many great poems in there, but there's one poem that I try and regularly teach, which is a poem by Lamia Ben Youssef, which is called Ophelia's Soliloquy. And I'm not going to read it out now, but as you can imagine, it's a brilliant political riff on a moment from Hamlet. And it's always good to talk back to Hamlet, in my view. And when I first met Paul Farley, I found out that he was really interested in Michael Drayton and Michael Drayton's poem Polyolbion. And I've quite recently found out that Paul Muldoon was really interested in John Donne. And here we have, from 2012, I think. Paul, is that right? Yeah.
That's right. That particular edition is from there.
That's right. And Paul Muldoon has also very recently published a poem in the Times Literary Supplement, which I'm guessing is an homage to Andrew Marvell or Marvel, which is called, and I'm just going to have to read this so I get it right, The Glowworm to the Mower.
That's correct. It's a little about, we'll talk a little bit about it later, but it's the kind of the reverse angle shot, as it were, to the great Marvel poem.
Yeah, brilliant. So I've got a question just to kick everything off, and then I'm hoping I can sort of recede into the background. So I'm going to ask Paul Farley, how long-standing is your interest in Renaissance poetry?
How long-standing? You know, I found the metaphysical poets through a movie called A Matter of Life and Death, which is a Powell and Pressburger movie set at the end of the Second World War. And if you've seen this movie, it's in glorious technicolor, except when it's in heaven, when it's in black and white. David Niven plays an airman who's been shot down, and he chooses to spend his moments when he's fallen out of the sky reciting poetry. And the two poems, I think the two poems he recites or quotes from as he falls to earth are Walter Raleigh, Give Me My Scallop Shell, you know, the Passionate Pilgrimage, and Andrew Marvel. I'm going to say Marvel because David Niven says, Andy Marvel, what a marvel. So and that bookends the metaphysics, I think. You know, in the Helen Gardner book, which I'm going to hold up a prop, this is the first time I discovered them in print. This was given to me when I was about 19, 20, that kind of age, along with this book, A Choice of Poets, with somebody staring into the I think it's the Thames, and they're all there. So that's how I came across the metaphysical poets for the first time, and I've been reading them off and on, mostly on, ever since.
Thank you. So, same question to you, Professor Muldoon.
Oh, when did I get interested in them? Well, actually, in much the same way. I'm a little older than Paul Farley, so the edition of Helen Gardner's The Metaphysical Poets that, pardon me, that I read as a teenager was a slightly different one in terms of its outward appearance. Inwardly, it was just the same. And it was a text that we had for an exam. I'm not sure if it was O level or A level, can't quite remember. But certainly we were all reading Donne and Marvel. And by the way, he somewhere along the way has some fun with that word, and he uses it in the marvelous sense. So I tend to go for Marvel. But my mainstay was John Donne. And, it was an interesting experience for me. I was brought up in Northern Ireland. And that particular part of Northern Ireland where I was brought up was actually, in County Armagh, was actually settled or planted by Englishmen, of course, in the Elizabethan era. And most of them actually came from Warwickshire, as it turns out. And there were still a number of, so there are many usages in the area that my father would have, things my father would have said. But for example, he would have said, I deem it to be. He would say, in troth, quite unself-consciously. So when I read John Donne's The Good Morrow, I wonder by my troth what thou and I did till we loved, with that extraordinary enjambment, did coming around the corner and did, were we not weaned till then? I sort of, this sounds a bit fanciful, I know, but I think actually I had a fellow feeling for him just in terms of the language, odd though it may sound. But of course, the main interest was in the poems themselves. And the one that I was particularly taken by, maybe I'll just run with this if I may, was The Flea. And so I'll read that if I may. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee. And in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou know'st this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead, yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do. Oh, stay, 3 lives in one flea spare, where we almost, yea, more than married are. This flea is you and I, and this our marriage bed and marriage temple is, though parents grudge and you, we're met and cloistered in these living walls of jet. Though use may make you apt to kill me, let not to that self-murder added be. And sacrilege, 3 sins in killing 3. Cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence. Wherein could this flea guilty be, except in that drop which it sucked from thee? Yet thou triumphest and sayest that thou find'st not thyself, nor me, the weaker now. 'Tis true, then learn how false fears be. Just so much honour, when thou yield'st to me, will waste as this flea's death took life from thee. One of the greatest pickup poems, as it were, in English literature and perhaps any other. So I began writing poems myself in a very modest way, of course, in the spirit of John Donne, very interested in the conceit, the extended metaphor, taking one idea and some someone who was less than keen on the metaphysicals, and did, as you know, the term metaphysicals was used disparagingly of these poets. So I was interested from the outset in gold to airy thinness beat, and taking an idea, running with it. And I'll read one little poem of my own in that respect, and then hand over to Paul, if I may. So this is a poem called Hedgehog, and it kind of dates me, and it dates the poem. I mean, it's one of the great arguments for trying not to be up to the moment in poetry, because the moment quickly becomes very passé. And in this case, there's a reference to the hovercraft. And at the time this poem was written, in the late 1960s, the hovercraft seemed to be, I mean, it was like Elon Musk going to Mars, basically. It was the coming thing. There was nothing like it. And of course, it seems to have disappeared completely off the face of the water. Anyway, the snail moves like a hovercraft held up by a rubber cushion of itself, sharing its secret with the hedgehog. The hedgehog shares its secret with no one. We say, hedgehog, come out of yourself and we will love you. We mean no harm. We want only to listen to what you have to say. We want your answers to our questions. The hedgehog gives nothing away, keeping itself to itself. We wonder what a hedgehog has to hide, why it so distrusts. We forget the God under this crown of thorns. We forget that never again will a God trust in the world. And that's the kind of poem, I suppose, that may only be written by a 17 or 18-year-old. Only a 17 or 18-year-old has the nerve to come up with something like that. So anyway, that was myself and John done.
Thank you so much. I mean, Paul, have you got a poem that you'd like to sort of bring into the frame, a particular one? Because I think metaphysical poetry is such a horrible term in a way. It's so off-putting. And what just struck me there, Paul, while Paul Farley's thinking of a poem to read, was just how you found fellow feeling in the poetry, because quite a lot of the time it can seem quite alienating. But yeah, so Paul Farley, do you have a poem of particular memory?
Yeah, I mean, I was thrilled by Donne. I think for largely the same reasons as Paul's just been describing. The wit and the angularity of it, and just the thrill of it. The thrill of kind of having an idea and running with it and seeing how far, what kind of a joyride you could take the reader on. That was, and funnily enough, actually, sometimes his language could be well dated. So I remember, I think it's in, I'm not sure, I think it's in a Nocturnal on St. Lucy's Day, where he describes flasks of light, and I could for ages couldn't work out. He's talking about the stars. And so you see the way over time stuff is, it's like Paul's hovercraft stuff's there, and then suddenly it isn't available anymore. But the idea of the conceit, I loved, and running with that. And so I could read one of mine if it's okay.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's another way of connecting now with then, but I'm gonna bring Dryden into the equation, who I think breaks the Trades Description Act for metaphysicals. I think he was one of the people who first started using the term, because like Paul has said, I don't think they thought of themselves as metaphysicals. So he's cuspal or proto-modern or something. Anyway, there's a line from Dryden that stuck in my head for a long time, even before I knew it was a line from a Dryden poem. Happy the man and happy he alone, he who can call today his own. And also this poem I'm going to read has got something to do, so we're getting into the conceit here, I suppose, by misunderstanding and being ignorant of something in another metaphysical poet, Herbert in this case, using the word sweet or sweets. It crops up in a lot of the poetry of that period, I think. And in my ignorance, I said sweets. I thought the metaphysicals were keen on their confectionery. But you might remember how we used to waste time in a very particular way in childhood by looking through the cellophane wrappers of sweet wrappers. I have props, so like this, which makes everything go like that. Yeah, so this was before the internet, and everything becomes this vivid monochrome. So it turns out most of us, I think, did this roughly our age. And so I ended up with an imitation of a Dryden poem, which itself is his imitation of a classical poem by Horace. So there's a lot of telescoping or kaleidoscoping or something going on here. So this is called Quality Street. How many other kids would turn themselves into a camera replete with scrims and gels and tints to see the world in new colours? Soul billows through net curtains. A glutton takes his favourite seat and sets to working through a tin of Quality Street. The wrapper of a strawberry cream unpeels a vivid red to dye the evening bloody monochrome. Under a pre-Cambrian sky, the scale of blood and blood shadow has made an ancient fortress of the Masonettes. A dog crossing the square has flayed alive, leaves bloody tracks and looks back with a blood-bright eye. Before it finds a bin shed door and roots the open guts of bin liners, all in the light of a great fire. And when our sun becomes a swollen core, there will be other evenings like this to endure. But this is now, or rather then. The gold is taken from a toffee penny and held over the eyes. Gold cellophane that makes a legend of the rain. A sheet so small being beaten out by greedy vision until the whole estate turns lustrous from the eye's electroplate. Blue next from a coconut macaroon, the day for night filter you might look through to turn a sun into a moon. That dog's a quink hound now. The swing park is a ruin. The shrubs outside the highwayman scratch up against the galleon pub sign that's swinging in a wind straight out of Queen Anne's England. And there's a general deepening, 1,000 shades cast by the washing on the lines that tacks hard like a navy in full sail. Lee, Wrangler, Fruit of the Loom, restored to virginal denim, and midges in a street lamp's glow are swirling like marine snow at depths where light isn't supposed to go. But too much blue is bad. It suffocates the senses to spend all your time in this sliver of the spectrum. And blue is prescience of celestial fate, the concrete present flooded by eternal weight. Adding a yellow wrapper to the sheet of blue creates a green which covers everything, 1,000 years of growth at once, our steady state if given half a chance, and you can hear birds sing. Empire of moss and long barrow. Each doorway is an earth entrance to long ago and ever since, a source, a hatch, a mammal burrow that slows the eye and leads us down into a sump where we could drown happily in a medium we've never known, the future yet to reign, the past long flown. But winter comes back harder. Flesh falls from the bones of trees, whose flooded nests hang plain, this novelty of looking drained away. And which of us could say, tomorrow do thy worst, for I have lived today. Quinoline yellow, beta-carotene, allura red, riboflavin, tartrazine. You took us out of time and gave us power to hype the moment, die the day, and rob the hour. Sorry, that was longer than I remembered it being. I'm not ready for it.
No, it's great. It's fabulous. I love Die the Day. I mean, there's a little pun in there too, isn't there? There's DYE, of course, in the sense of the scrim, as it were, from the Quality Street wrapper. But there's also Die, which, of course, You know, one of the things we delighted in as schoolboys, I went to an old boys' school, reading Donne was all these naughty allusions. So, and when we figured out what the word die meant, of course, in everyday Elizabethan parlance, and when we figured out that in Elizabethan orthography or writing, that S and F were essentially the same thing, and when the flea sucks one and then the other, we went to town on that. No, that's a fabulous poem. I love it. It's great.
I mean, I think again it comes back to the ways in which I think metaphysical poetry can be taught, was taught, is perhaps still taught. That idea that we can find fellow feeling, you know, with sort of all these kind of centuries, and they are about bodies and sex and living in the world in ways that sometimes when they're taught, you know, just gets evacuated. And I think what I took from both your poems really was your kind of focusing in on the world, you know, and sort of like from snails, which happened to be a big passion of mine, but that's another story, and hedgehogs through to moss, via the way of kind of Levi Jeans in Fruit of the Loom, which is probably as historical as the hovercraft, Paul.
Yeah,
I'm not sure, but still, I mean, it also kind of puts me in a particular generation, I think. I mean, why should anyone read Renaissance poetry now? I mean, you've shown really well, and more than I could have hoped for, why it's been important to you. But if you were speaking to a group of 14-year-olds now, obviously I'm being very general because they're not all homogenous, but what would you say to them if they'd never picked up a 17th century poem or heard of the metaphysicals, which is possible in the climate we're in? Mm-hmm. What would you say to them? Why read this stuff?
Well, I think, you know, again, it was one of the detractors of these poets who pointed to the fact that this was a system that could engage with any subject matter. I mean, it's almost, you know, the variety and voraciousness of the eye in these poets, the wide-ranging, you know, from the latest scientific discoveries of the day, the latest discoveries in geography of the day, making metaphors, finding likenesses in the most unlikely places, which of course is one of the great impulses of not all necessarily, but much verse making. This is like this. And that is one of our most basic impulses. And it's an impulse that when we find a connection between things, or when it's presented to us in the world, something very basic happens. It makes us feel good. It sort of fires the pleasure center in the brain, and we have some version of a little high. So I think, you know, to introduce that to, I think one is only to read some of the poems to a 14-year-old, or have a 14-year-old read them themselves. I think, you know, there's a breakdown of barrier. It's not that stuffy old poetry thing that people who essentially don't read poetry have come to associate with the very idea of poetry.
Yeah, you wonder what John Donne would have made of our century, our young, just left its teenage years century. His Bermudas and probes into space, the mapping of the genome. Can you imagine?
Well, I often do think in those terms, actually, Paul. I mean, he would go to town on that. I mean, and, you know, and the lovely thing is that he gives an example to the rest of us, that we might indeed go to town on finding metaphors that are based on the genome, you know? It's a world-opening poetry. It opens things up rather than shuts them down.
And it's that close focus as well, isn't it? What I like about metaphysical poetry, or poetry by people like Donne and Marvell and Catherine Phillips. I'm just going to bring Catherine Phillips in there, who is sometimes mentioned as a metaphysical poet, but not often enough. But their scrutiny of the world, so working these sort of objects, this intense looking at the world. And I think maybe in this COVID year we've had, a lot of us have slowed down a lot, and it's given us opportunity to look at things differently, which sounds like a cliche. In many ways it is, but every time I read one of these poems, and just hearing you read your own poems, it's about capturing a moment in time and just sort of being still with the words and the images, which I still find extraordinary.
I mean, funnily enough, I find myself going back to Donne in the COVID era, as in every era. I actually went back to a particular poem, and I might read a little bit of it, if I may. It's his great series of Holy Sonnets. I'm not going to read them all. I'll read a little bit of the first one, Deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise, weaved in my low, devout melancholy. Thou, which of good hast, yea, art treasury, all changing, unchanged, ancient of days. But do not with a vile crown of frail bays reward my muse's white sincerity. What a great word, white sincerity. But what thy thorny crown gained, that gave me a crown of glory, which doth flower always. The ends crown our works, but thou crown'st our ends. For at our end begins our endless rest, the first last end, now zealously possessed. With a strong, sober thirst, my soul attends. 'Tis time that heart and voice be lifted high. Salvation to all that will is nigh. And of course, this is a series of poems. There's a reference to it there, the garland, the crown of sonnets, the Holy Sonnets. So that the next one, for example, picks up with that, the last line of the first, the second kicks in with the same line, salvation to all that will is nigh. So it's known, of course, as a corona of sonnets, and I, needless to say, always a sucker for a pun. I find myself writing in the time of Corona a little sequence of sonnets, what's known as a heroic crown of sonnets, which is 15 sonnets. 14, where the first line of one bleeds, the end of the first one bleeds into the beginning of the second, and so on, and the 15th made up for some reason of the first and / last lines of the previous 14. Completely crazy. But anyway, I'll read just one of these to give you a little taste of it. And again, this is what one of the things that Donne means to me. He actually shows a way. He shows a way of dealing with this kind of massive material that assails us and assaults us every day. At the end of our driveway, the yellow recycling bin will be picked up this morning by Vlad, our superintendent of public works. I certainly don't want to impugn the motives of the village elders who, after the big flood washed it out, closed our road to through traffic. That's proved to be largely a godsend. It's now only once or twice a day an Orphic figure passes, glancing back for whatever has his scent, and will, somewhat soonish, tear him limb from limb. Were it open, the picture house in Cobleskill would be showing a shoot 'em up or creature feature. For 3 weeks now, Jean and I have been on the lam in Sharon Springs, a couple of old school bank robbers lying low for the foreseeable future. And however little it might sound like it, and for what it's worth, is almost nothing, that's a sonnet. So, and then it bleeds into the next one. But in any case, I'll hand over to Paul.
I mean, you've brilliantly brought in form, because when I was learning about poetry, what I always found most off-putting was all the lectures I had on versification, which just seemed to kind of halt everything. But I once heard Paul Farley give a brilliant lecture when I just arrived, likening the sonnet to a 45 single. So again, that's quite a while ago now. I'm not sure. Actually, you might now, because vinyl obviously is making a comeback. So Paul Farley, could you say a bit more about form? Because I think that as well as content, you know, these poems could tell us something about or help us with crafting poetry itself. Yeah.
Yeah, they are marvelously form is to the forefront. I mean, it's not the first thing. Well, maybe sometimes it's the first thing you notice if you, I don't know, if you read Easter Wings by Herbert or something. It's kind of it's doing something before you've read a word of it, you know. Yeah, I think every time anybody writes a sonnet, we're all putting a penny in the meter for Wyatt or Sidney or whoever first brought it into the English language. And then just the sense of this archive and resource and this infinite sort of traffic, this back and forth, this way you can keep upcycling or recycling or subverting or reinventing, endlessly kind of approachable, like we just heard that marvelous, the beginning of that marvelous poem by Paul, endlessly reapproachable, and so much it can, such a yield, you know, that it can give out. And also in another way, I mean, you should also mention that thing about, I've already said Easter Wings now, so Herbert and his shapes. When I read I'm going to hold it up again, the Helen Gardner book, there's a choice of Herbert in there, and it's fantastic. But a long time afterwards, I read The Temple, and really started to see those shapes, and to see the way he made this house or this church. You enter through the porch, you pass under the lintel, the superliminaire, and you see the altar, and this construction. So the madeness really kind of got me thinking about the madeness of a poem and poetic form, and that's never left me. That's a powerful lesson.
And I think for me as well, when I you know, I think I first encountered the Romantics, you know, and that idea that poetry was just this overflow of emotion, that cliche term. But when I first encountered Elizabethan poetry, particularly, realizing that absolutely it wasn't. This, you know, these were people that sort of crafted and crafted and crafted. And I think in terms of writing itself, that stayed with me. I think that idea that you might start with an overflow of emotion, but to then try and sort of push that into a poem or a piece of prose takes work.
Well, one of the great things about the metaphysicals is that they are coincidentally capable of extraordinary emotion. I mean, one of the things that we in this era may learn, and in every era from them, let's just stick with Donne for a minute. Batter my heart, three-person God. For God's sake, hold thy tongue and let me love. I mean, he is a man. I mean, if there isn't emotion, if those lines aren't emotionally charged, I can't imagine what would be. So he's brilliant at kicking off a poem that may, of course, like the flea, get itself involved in all sorts of intellectual convolutions. But it's an emotional thrust, for want of a better term, that the poem is based on. You know, it's charged with good old-fashioned lust, actually, right? And so you know, Donne, of course, is extraordinarily manages to take something of that erotic force and. Later in his life and in his, you know, I actually love his prose also and his sermons. You know, he's able to focus that on his relationship with the Godhead, which is remarkable.
Professor Farley, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I have a thought, but nobody cares what I think, but I'm going to say something in a minute.
I don't care what you think.
Now, go on, what do you think, Liz?
No, I invite you. I'm hosting, gently hosting, remember.
I mean, Paul's absolutely right. There's lots of emotion. It's a long time before emotion recollected in tranquility and a kind of that romantic formulation. But there's powerful feeling. I mean, I always think with Donne, especially, he's very how can I put this? There's something very immediate about him. He kind of works on you very kind of quickly. He's really speaking to you, and they've got great first lines often as well. You're right there. You're right in Medea's res. You're kind of right into something. I like that about him in particular as well. But yeah, they're very, very. I mean, almost pungent. It's the danger, isn't it? If we're talking about form, it can start to sound kind of like something remote or dare I say, academic and distant, or like an exercise, and it's anything but.
Yeah, and I think for me, I was going to say, for me, I suppose we've spent a lot of time talking about John Donne, which is great. There are so many other writers. I think as well, Donne does give us a particular insight into the mindset of a particular 17th century man, in a way. Obviously, he's a product of his time, and I think it would be wrong of me not to mention, well, it's very sexist in many ways. It's quite difficult to teach, and I'm using sexist, advisedly. It's very difficult to teach John Donne sometimes in the classroom now. To enjoy the language, because so much of it is kind of shaped by very difficult ideological ideas for us in 2021. I think that shouldn't stop us reading John Donne, but I do think that what I'd like to just ask you to finish. It's really what should come first: the reading of the poetry or a prefatory essay saying this person is a product of its time, or this poem is a product of its time?
Well,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say he's interestingly isn't any one thing, John Donne. There's a life there, and I mean, can we say that there's some of the poem is a young man of his times poetry, and then you get an older man who's taken orders and so on, and leading a completely different kind of life. I don't think it's as stable as any one thing. But I've never taught him, so I've not actually confronted that in a classroom situation. And of course, looked at through the lens of now. Yeah, of course, it's there are hardly any, if any, for example, female writers from that particular metaphysical period. What are we to do? Yeah.
Well, I do think we have to read everything in the context of its moment. Be that moment, as we started out, the 1960s. Language keeps changing first of all, language keeps changing all the time. Paul used the word flask there, or referred to the flask. For most of us, of a certain age, a flask was something you brought your soup to. You used to bring your soup to work, right? A flask, in the context of that poem that Paul Farley was referring to, might have been a powder flask. It's likely to be that as a flask or a flagon of containing a drink. Things keep changing all the time. Words keep changing all the time. The word team doesn't quite mean what it meant even 2 years ago. I mean, we're now on a system called Teams. The word friend doesn't mean what it meant 10 years ago. The word Zoom doesn't mean what it meant 3 years ago. The words are changing constantly, and also mores are changing constantly. World pictures are changing constantly, and what is thought to be appropriate in one era, or at least not inappropriate, of course changes. But you know, we we when we read the Scottish play, for example, it's really useful to have a sense that James was interested in witchcraft, for example. You know, and that actually helps contextualize how we read a play like that. So every poem, including poems of this moment, have to be contextualized. One thing I would say, and I actually say to my students here, there, and everywhere, is that the poetry bit, just to take one particular aspect of contemporary intellectual life, and academic life in particular, that's the trigger warning. Whatever else John Donne is interested in, trigger warnings ain't one of them. Because, you know, what he is keen to do, and many, as Paul Farley said, we get in there in medias res. He wants to grab you by the scruff of the neck, and he wants to grab your attention and to hold it. And he's not going to say to you by way of preamble, by the way, gentle reader, I may have a little bit of a shock for you, right? He just gives it to you. And I think, you know, when we go into the poetry business, as when we go into a fairground, you know, we have to be prepared for being taken aback. If you go on a fairground ride, there's no point in sort of coming out the other end and saying, oh, I didn't really expect that, you know, trigger warning or not. But in any case,
There might be a difference there, actually, because I'm clearly not a poet. I spend a lot of my time writing, you know, writing about dead people's writing, and that's a privilege. And I think because they're never going to talk back at me, but I think there is something here to do with privilege as well, and why you're reading as well. I think there's a very different response to anything, isn't there? If you're reading it, you know, like if you're reading it in a classroom situation, if you've been told to read it. Which isn't really what we're talking about, but I introduced the topic, so I'll continue for a bit. That there is a difference if you're being told to read it. You know, I think there's a difference between the sort of picking up a book and finding it for yourself, if that makes sense. So maybe it's just the responsibility I feel with these poems in a teaching situation might be different than the one you know, beyond that. But again, it's about context, I suppose, where you're reading a poem as well as where the poem's from.
Yes. The language is never, like Paul has just said, the language doesn't keep still. We're moving away from the poem in time. The poem is written in a particular context. Everything is moving. There's no rigid or possible. But funnily enough, the only thing the interesting thing that does carry across time and space is the kind of that little kind of click of pleasure or that click of engagement when one is, as Paul's just put it, when the reader's taken by the scruff of the neck. Perhaps there is something that kind of always manages to kind of cut through and exceed, you know, its context and all the rest of it. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I think as I asked that question, it wasn't to try and sort of put a halt to the conversation. And I suppose it's really just to sort of foreground the idea that the poetry in these poems, as all poems, are moving all the time. You must find it when you're giving a poetry reading that people respond to your poetry in all kinds of ways. And I think in a classroom environment too, you know, people will respond to the poem. And I think that's a good thing in a way, because it's kind of getting an emotional reaction. But those reactions aren't always positive ones, and I think it just speaks the power of words, really, which again in the climate we're in is important to remember. And I also think that the poems you've spoken about this afternoon, I'm just going to go back to the flea, really, and without collapsing historical and cultural differences, the flea has sustained as an organism, and the flea, the 16th century flea, I mean, I'm not Darwin, obviously, but, you know, we can recognise the flea. You know, the flea is still pretty much the same flea that John Donne would have encountered. So I think that's also about the powerful idea. Hovercrafts may come and go, but fleas,
Yes.
hopefully,
Yeah.
climate change notwithstanding, will still be there.
Yes, I mean, I can certainly understand a context in which, you know, the position of the speaker in the flea is not necessarily one that we would always admire at the moment. I mean, I'm not sure how influenced he would be by Me Too. In fact, I'd say not at all. But so we read poems with that in mind. And you know what? My own view is that we need to read poems and everything else mindful of what they are bringing to us, less than what we are bringing to them. You know, if one is going to be educated, for example, I mean, in my opinion, that means that one opens oneself, one exposes oneself to a range of possibilities. It doesn't mean, that certainly didn't mean to me when I was beginning my education, that I wanted to hear simply what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear what I'd never heard. And I think, you know, sometimes we run the risk of losing sight of that. We should be going to education and to reading a poem for what it brings to us, not what we bring to it, on balance.
Paul, anything you want to add?
I'll read another poem.
I thought you were getting ready. I could see you. I thought, yes.
I was getting ready, and I was. It's all kind of screens and filters, and I was thinking of, just to backtrack to that flea just for a moment. Did that have anything to do with what's the guy's name with the microscope in the 17th century? Hook.
Oh, Hook. Yeah. And
does that have,
yeah.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, these little tiny things are as things that are palpable, tangible, viewable.
Is it the idea of the homunculus or something like that, or that one sees just life in microscopic conditions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'll read a poem called. You know what I'll read? It's got something to do with the Scottish play. I nearly said.
I got thrown out of a theatre the other day and exorcised and sort of bell booked and candled for using the term within a theatre. I'm serious. This was about a year ago. I was thrown out of a theatre for using that word.
Business, yeah. So I'll read it. Actually, and I'll read it because Liz, you remembered me reading it and mentioned it before we came on air. So it features it takes a minor character from the Scottish play, Fleance, who's the son of Banco, and as you know, and it looks at him through the lens of a film version of that play, which was made by Roman Polanski in the early 1970s. And in this film, Fleance is played by none other than Keith Chegwin, Cheggers, who's sadly no longer with us, star of children's television here in the UK for many years, and when I was growing up. So it tends to ruin the film for people when I mention this to them, because they spend the entire film looking out for this character. Anyway, here we go. Keith Chegwin as Fleance. The next rung up from extra and dog's body, and all the cliches are true. Days waiting for enough light, learning card games, penny ante, while fog rolls off the sea, a camera gets moisture in its gate, and Roman Polanski curses the day he chose Snowdonia. He picked you for your hair to play this role. A look had reached Bootle from Altamont that year. You wouldn't say you sold your soul, but learned your line inside a beating tent by candlelight, the shingle dark as coal behind each wave and its slight restatement. A tale told by an idiot, not your turn, but perhaps with time and practice, the poll starts. Who's to say behind the accent and that grin what designs you had on playing a greater part? The crew get ready while the stars go in. You speak the words you'd written on your heart, just as the long-awaited sunrise fires the sky a bluish pink. Who could have seen this future in the late schedules where I can't sleep and watch your flight from the big screen? On the other side of drink and wondering why, the zany household name years in between. Somebody knocked at my door just as I was reading that, and they're still knocking at the door now. Anything to do with this Scottish play? It's you're on hide to knock.
It's the porter. Is the porter available?
Oh yes, and it's I mean, I think the conversation we've had this afternoon has just been marvellous, and I just thank you for your time. As I say, it's so evident that I am not a poet, and so it's been wonderful to have two poets of your, calibre, if I may say, in front of me talking about Renaissance poetry. Thank you ever so much. It's been a pleasure. Is there anything you'd like to add before we go off to do the rest of our work?
It's just so nice to see people,
Yes, it's such fun. It's always a delight to talk to Paul Farley, and now it's a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you. And I'm just, I'm itching to say the title of the Scottish play, but I'm not going to do it. So on that note, thank you very much indeed. And I'll give you a round of applause from everybody watching. And thank you, and go off and write some brilliant poetry.